Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning briefing for Thursday, the 19th of June, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Good to be back on. Robert's on the show today, joining me. And with that, Robert, good morning. Let's go ahead and jump into our domestic sit rep for today. Starting off with the latest from the White House. Apparently, the Trump administration is considering this tax exemption rule for colleges. What's going on?
Good morning, Mike. So apparently the Trump administration is quietly discussing a potential rule change for IRS policies that would allow them to revoke the tax exempt status for universities if they consider race in admissions. And from what I've seen, tax law experts are saying that this would be a major sea change for universities, and the proposed rule could be so strong against universities that it would actually have them start modifying their behavior to align with the Trump administration before this new rule is actually implemented.
Mm-hmm. All right, interesting. And then I'm sure this is going to be caught up in the courts, Robert, briefly.
Yeah, it just like the previous attempt or previous threat from Trump to remove tax exempt status, this will end up in a lengthy court fight. But I think these tax lawyers are saying that it doesn't even have to actually succeed. The Trump administration just putting this rule out there is going to have at least some universities start to toe the line to the Trump administration.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. All right, and then let's move on to McKinsey. Foreign companies are rethinking U.S. investment. You know, Robert, I've read this from some investment bank reports. I think Deutsche Bank has probably been the most pessimistic in saying how the Trump administration has effectively curbed foreign direct investment into the United States or has disincentivized international investors from seeking safe haven status in U.S. Treasuries of the dollar. So this is not unfounded. But McKinsey's talking about foreign companies rethinking U.S. investments. So what's the latest?
Yeah, this is from McKinsey's global managing partner Bob Sternfels, and this was actually an interview I think it was a hearing with the Trump administration. I think it was the Federal Reserve Bank. And he said, they're considering opportunities outside of the U.S. because they're concerned not only about being vulnerable to tariffs, but also the shifting U.S. economic and geopolitical positions from the Trump administration. And I think part of this is also included in the quote, big, beautiful bill is that revenge tax, because the Trump administration wants to place a punitive income tax on foreign investments if their country of origin puts a tax against U.S. tech companies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what was it? Section 899 or something like that, 699. That's part of the big, beautiful bill. Would enable the Trump administration to impose taxes on U.S. investments. So I think that's very important. And then moving on here, we're going to talk a little bit more about the lack of riots and relative lack of protests. But as of now, Los Angeles mayor has lifted the curfew. Is that as of last night or tonight?
I believe it was last night. And Mayor Karen Bass said that she cited what she said was successful ongoing crime prevention efforts to secure businesses in residential areas in Los Angeles from, quote, bad actors who do not care about the immigrant community, which I assume she's talking about, people who come out to these protests and start engaging in looting, which has hit the news when the riots were going on over the weekend. She did say that the city government is prepared to reissue the curfew if necessary, but I haven't seen any indicators that they're planning to do it anytime soon.
Mm-hmm. And Robert, we will get there in just a second, but the Trump administration has ordered another 2,000 National Guard troops mobilized for LA. As of now, like last night, I didn't see any fighting with cops, no violence. Actually, I think nationwide we probably had zero anti-ICE violence, at least that I could pick up on. But we're still seeing these National Guard troops being mobilized and maybe into other areas. Any indication on, I guess, the Trump administration is going to keep them mobilized for the next at least 30, 45 days here?
I haven't seen any specific time frame, but I think that the Trump administration probably views it as having an effective deterrent effect. And that's probably why this is seems to be dying down a little bit for now, is that they have arrested multiple people, they including elected officials who've interfered with ICE arrests. Like we covered Brad Linder, the New York City comptroller, who was arrested by ICE yesterday or the day before. And so I think the Trump administration perceives it as having a deterrent effect.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then let's move on to our global sit rep here. We're going to cover this in detail here in just a second, but Trump's kind of playing this will he, won't he game with the media because they ask him every day, are you going to strike Iran? And he says, well, maybe not. We'll just have to see. And as we're waiting for this, the Israelis are continuing to talk about their plans for Iran. The Israeli defense minister, Israel Katz, said that Iranian Supreme Leader Khamenei, quote, can no longer be allowed to exist. And this is what the Israeli defense minister said after an Iranian missile struck a hospital in Israel, rather. And just to tack this on here, I did notice there's a Shia terror group called Harakat Hezbollah al-Nujaba, and they're based in Iraq. And they were warning, by the way, they're part of the Sadrist Popular Mobilization Forces, the Iranian-backed wing. And they did say that any targeting of Khamenei would lead to U.S. nationals being targeted in the Middle East. That's one of those red lines, things that I think probably shouldn't happen if the United States wants to avoid getting not just ankle deep or knee deep, but maybe waist deep in a conflict in the Middle East. That's one of those things that probably should not happen. Also, moving on to the Gulf Cooperation Council, GCC countries, there are 6 of them: Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar. They have activated their Regional Emergency Operations Center, and they say this is in preparation for, quote, various emergency scenarios, including those involving chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear weapons. This does appear to be out of abundance of caution. I read their statement. It didn't seem like they had credible expectations that anything would happen. Again, out of abundance of caution, but I do think this is important that these countries are preparing potentially for escalation here. Also, I would just note that Russia is also warning that strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities could result in a quote-unquote Chernobyl-style catastrophe. Russia does have about 200 personnel, or they say they have about 200 personnel at the Bushehr nuclear facility in Iran, and they said that they do have an agreement with Israel, and that Israel has essentially promised to protect these Russian personnel at Bushehr. So apparently that may not be targeted. And I think the Israelis actually claimed to have targeted that Bushehr nuclear facility, and then they walked that back and said, no, we didn't. So just to keep everyone up to date there. Meanwhile, earlier this week, we had talked about the potential for carrier strike groups moving into the region. Robert, it looks like the Pentagon is moving potentially 3, but what's the latest here?
So, a U.S. official said that the USS Ford Carrier Strike Group is going to deploy to Europe next week, and this deployment has actually been on the books for a few weeks now. However, this U.S. official did say it's likely going to move into the Eastern Mediterranean Sea to be closer to Israel, which it would be, I think, as you said, the 3rd Carrier Strike Group that would be moving into the region.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that. And then moving on here, last item on the sit rep before we get into some details here. Let's talk about China jostling to supplant the global dollar system. There's been a lot of talk about the Chinese yuan, the digital yuan, replacing the U.S. dollar. Not going to happen. But China does want to displace the dollar, the use of the dollar in certain parts of the world. There's a financial forum in Shanghai this week where People's Bank of China governor Pan Gongsheng said he expects the global monetary system to fracture into multipolarity. Not a lot of news there, but he said this would, quote, better safeguard global financial stability. Basically, he's saying if the world's not dependent on the dollar, then the dollar will be seemingly the world will be at less risk, is what he's saying. The People's Bank of China is also setting up an international operations center to internationalize the digital yuan. Also in an op-ed this week, European Central Bank President Christine Lagarde wrote about she called it a global euro moment, basically saying since dollar dominance is being called into question, maybe this is the time for the euro to step up to replace the dollar. I also don't see that happening. But here we have both the EU and China talking about how they plan to help supplant the use of the dollar globally. And with that, let's go ahead and jump into some of our low intensity conflict items here. We are tracking 36 protests coming up today, which is it's baseline for midweek. Most of these are extremely small protests. I don't think that I've seen none of this leads me to believe that there will be some imminent risk of violence. Although we do see Portland and Seattle there, and LA, which it always remains possible. Also, just for the SIGAC's quick significant activities overnight, I did not see any acts of anti-ICE violence. This is not to say that they did not happen. It's still 6 a.m. in California, so maybe some of them haven't been picked up on the news. If you do see them, please let me know. That's one thing we would like to get the audience involved in. If you do end up seeing any acts of anti-ICE violence or far left or what you might call domestic violent extremist activity, please do pass it up to us, and we will continue to track this. Also, I'm going to bring Robert back here in just a moment, but I want to talk about one of these things. Just reading the news every day, you start to see some of these trends. And one of those trends since January has been, what will the Democrat Party do in order to stop Trump? And this is something that, we look at these No Kings protests that we saw last weekend. Okay, they said they had 5 million people mobilized for this protest. I think that's probably inflated. I don't think it's impossible, but let's just say it was 5 million. What did that accomplish? And there was in the USA Today, there was some opinion writer said, "Oh yeah, it's great, one of the largest protests in U.S. history." But what did it accomplish? It really didn't accomplish anything. And effectively, I think they're right. The Philadelphia Inquirer editorial board also probably pointed to one of these reasons why it has not had any effect. I don't think it has been politically significant yet. But at any rate, Philly Inquirer editorial board criticized Democrats for, quote, failing to meet the moment during this No Kings National Day of Protest. They write, quote, while millions of average citizens attended the No Kings protest, quote, many Democratic leaders were in the Hamptons for the Soros-Abedin wedding. They say Democrats have failed to mount a sustained and unified response to all that Trump has wrought. Protests matter, but more must be done to combat the flood of misinformation coming from Trump and his supporters. A daily campaign is needed, using social media and TV commercials to better inform the public on how Trump's policies are hurting them. This is important for a couple of reasons. Before I get to that, let me just add on. One of the things I've been tracking is the OFA, Organizing for America. This was the Obama or post-Obama era organizing vehicle, and I've not seen a lot out of them. I do think it's significant whenever Obama starts to pipe up on Trump, because Obama was the first Democrat president that you could say, I think, at least in my lifetime, who was revolutionary. I mean, the guy was just an out-and-out Marxist. And so I've been waiting for Obama to get involved in this because he was the organizer in chief. And I don't know if it's his reluctance. I don't know exactly what's going on. Maybe there's a case to be made that Obama is just not as revolutionary as he was when he was young and broke. And now that he's old and wealthy, maybe he's lost some revolutionary zeal. I think that's a possibility. I think it's also possible that Obama is just not as influential as he was within those circles. And maybe that's because he's now old and wealthy. I don't know. But I've been waiting for Obama to get involved. And so this is probably as close to as involved as we've seen him over the weekend or maybe earlier this week. He gave a speech that was not covered by the press, but apparently there may have been a recording of it. But we are seeing some of these reports now coming out over the past couple of days. Obama accused the Trump administration of having a quote unquote weak commitment to democratic norms, adding that the United States is, quote, drifting into something that is not consistent with American democracy. He says, quote, it is consistent with autocracies. Obama also added that the U.S. now is, quote, dangerously close to normalizing autocratic behavior. Obama towards the end of the speech, I guess it was towards the end of the speech, had something of a conclusion. And he said, quote, "We now have a situation in which all of us are going to be tested in some way, and we're going to have to decide what our commitments will be." And he's basically talking about how easy it was to be a progressive under Obama and how easy it was to be wealthy and pretend, just let the Obama administration implement all these progressive reforms for the federal government. And now they don't have that luxury. They can't just sit back and be wealthy progressives. They actually have to get involved. And this is essentially what I think Obama was prodding them to do. From the very beginning, starting with that big April, the hands-off protest, Indivisible, the co-executive directors have maintained that this national protest movement and these national days of protest have had two goals. And the first goal was to show that there was widespread opposition against the Trump administration, to basically, as they say, put the Trump administration in check and let them know that it's not going to be easy, that the administration can't just go in and implement all these policies without some pushback. Okay. The second thing they wanted to do was encourage Democrats to be more aggressive in blocking the Trump administration. And so back in March, I talked about Senator Chris Murphy. He gave a town hall speech in which he said Democrat politicians are going to have to do a lot more, and they're going to have to take greater risks in stopping the Trump administration, because he says, quote, "There will come a time when Democrat politicians will call on the rank and file, the grassroots left, to come out and also take risks." And this is that same speech that Senator Murphy said that the left, or that at least Democrat politicians, had to take exceptional measures to push back against the Trump administration. And this week, I have seen several media outlets running stories on the number of Democrats who have been arrested or detained or charged under the Trump administration. Most of them knowingly incurred those risks. When you barge into a press conference unannounced and uninvited, yeah, you'll probably be detained just like anyone else would. When you commit trespassing, or when you allegedly shove a federal ICE agent, yeah, you will probably be arrested just like anyone else would, because no one is above the law. But I still look at this, and there is still a narrative being built that the Trump administration, they're just out to arrest Democrats, and they just want to persecute Democrats for their opposition to King Trump. And that's the narrative that we're seeing. So I don't think we're yet to a turning point, but I look at all these things and they're accelerators of conflict. When Democrats go out and put themselves in situations where they will probably be arrested, they obviously want to be arrested. There was this, I guess it was a rumor, but a couple of weeks ago, there was a meeting where Democrats said, at least according to reports, media reports, said, yeah, we should actually go out and be arrested because we could build this narrative that Trump is just trying to arrest all these Democrats. And then after that, we have seen a number of additional Democrats being arrested or detained. So I look at this, whenever we look at a conflict, we're looking at three main factors. There's fault lines. Okay, so this is the tectonic plates, whichever side of this earthquake that you're on. And then you have accelerators of conflict. So Democrats being arrested, I'd say these protests are an accelerator. Media coverage is an accelerator. These sporadic acts of violence and riots, I would say, are an accelerator. They're not a trigger. And then the third thing is the trigger. George Floyd was the trigger that we saw in 2020. I don't think we're close to a trigger event. And not to keep pounding this drum, but, a lot of people predicted that there were going to be riots during the election if Trump won. And then there were going to be riots during the inauguration. And none of those two things happened. And then this on January the 6th or the 8th or 9th, okay, we had a few nights of rioting. And this was it. Summer of Love 2.0. It's here. And, just looking at the situation, we're not even close to Summer of Love 2.0. We're not even to 2017 levels of violence and unrest. And we got to get to 2017 levels before we get to 2020 levels. And it's just not here. Last night, there were zero. I think maybe for the second night in a row, there was no violence, no anti-ICE violence in the country. That is obviously not going to continue to be the case. There will continue to be anti-ICE violence. The Trump administration, I think, has made it pretty clear. They're going to go into places like Seattle and Portland and Chicago and New York, and maybe even conduct large-scale ICE enforcement operations once they get done with LA. we're obviously going to see a lot more acceleration around this. But I just point this out. These are probably accelerators of conflict, not triggers of conflict. There's not enough pressure built up in the system right now for us to have another Summer of Love 2.0. It's just not going to happen unless we get some large scale acceleration. This is like you're like blowing up a balloon. Okay. There has to be a lot of hot air in a balloon before it can pop. And there's just not enough hot air built up in this balloon. And therefore it's not going to pop like it did in 2020. So at any rate, but I say this because when Obama comes out, the organizer in chief, really the revolutionary Marxist wing of the Democrat Party still, when he comes out and he's starting to tell people, you're going to have to make a decision soon. You're going to have to make a decision on what your commitments will be. I think that is significant. I think that is an accelerator. It's a foreshadowing of acceleration to come. I still think we could be years away from a trigger. And with that, let's bring Robert on. Robert, so this federal authorities arrested this guy in Nebraska for throwing a Molotov cocktail at a DHS building. What are the details here?
So the DOJ released this announcement last night, and this is 20-year-old Ulysses Martin. And they said that he was actually involved in 2 incidents around the building, which is being used by Homeland Security Investigations and ICE. And this is in Grand Island, Nebraska. Apparently, he threw a Molotov cocktail at the building, and then a few days later was actually caught by local police because he broke into the parking lot of the building and vandalized some federal vehicles, slashed their tires, and put up some graffiti, including graffiti on the building that said "Kill ICE."
Mm-hmm. All right, so this guy is being charged, and this is a federal felony here. We don't have any SIGACs on the Grand Island, Nebraska. We'll update that. And by the way, this is a really great example of something that's kind of local. Did not pop up on my radar following my feeds that I've built out for tracking anti-ICE violence. So we are about to start moving all of our early warning members over to the new website. And so that's one of the major lines of effort that we will have. If you see something, please say something, share it with us. If you see something in your local news, especially on the topic of protests, riots, anti-ICE violence. All right, thanks for that, Robert. And let's go ahead and talk about, finally, let's get to Iran. We're awaiting some potential strikes. The Israelis apparently believe the strikes could happen as soon as this weekend. Maybe. Robert, what say you?
Yeah, so there are apparently some people that are familiar with the discussions in the White House. They're saying Trump officials are preparing for a strike on Iran that could happen as soon as this weekend. And yesterday, a U.S. official did tell media that the sticking point here basically is that Trump is not convinced that a U.S. strike on Iran's Fordow nuclear facility would succeed, and that they were told by the Israeli government that Israel would go ahead if they had to do it alone and would even conduct a raid on the facility. And I think Trump's specific words was that he will not make a decision, or he will make a decision on a possible strike, quote, 1 second before it's due. So I think it's unlikely we'll know if the U.S. is going to join this conflict until at least hours before a strike actually happens. And I think possibly not even until after it actually is conducted. And I have seen, including I think there was that the interview that was released today or yesterday with Ted Cruz and Tucker Carlson, where he and a lot of other U.S. officials and elected officials have said that there's no plans for a ground invasion and a repeat of nation-building efforts that we saw during the global war on terror. However, I think if Israel and U.S. strikes do succeed in completely decapitating Iranian leadership, it's going to create a power vacuum in Iran, which I think could be filled by an Iranian faction that is willing to strike at the United States.
Mm-hmm. This has been my big concern. Just at a strategic level, we're about to talk about China's response to this Iran war. My problem is not preventing Iran from getting nuclear weapons. My problem is the assumption that we can just go in and bomb a nuclear facility and go back to day zero, or that we can just go in. Obviously, the Israelis, the Israelis are very clear about this. Preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon is a delaying tactic. I think Israel's tired of mowing the grass here. I do think they want a decapitation strike. I do think they want to kill. I do think they want regime change in Iran. And so my problem with that is the assumption that we can just go in, kill a country's leaders, or enable the Israelis to, or maybe even just allow, or maybe the Israelis just go do it without input from the Trump administration. And then we can just back away and everything's going to be fine. Like, this will not turn into another Iraq, or it will not turn into another Syria. But this time with potentially radiological material floating around. So I think it's good to see some caution here and maybe some waiting here from the Trump administration. This is obviously not something that they want to rush into, and I think it's good that we're not rushing into it. I think all supporters, frankly, people who support this potential decision by the Trump administration, by President Trump, to go in and bomb this Fordo nuclear facility, I think you have to be prepared that it's not just going to be a one and done, that we're probably going to get sucked into something potentially much deeper. And I think that's the biggest risk. Robert, before we move on to the Chinese response, what say you?
Yeah, I think there's this perception among the commentary and even U.S. elected officials who have said this, that a decapitation, like eliminating Iranian leadership, would allow Iranians to overthrow the oppressive government. But I think the much more likely you would see factions that are already militarily organized, because they're not talking about killing every single IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps member or officer. And I think it's more likely you would see somebody try to fill that power vacuum coming from, one of those factions that already has a military organization, because they expect that these protesters that we see in Tehran constantly protesting against the regime are going to step in. But I don't think that historically fits with any kind of base case for an actual change in government.
Mm-hmm. Let me just say this too. I remember, I'm not an Iran guy, but I remember doing a country study of Iran just as on one of those things. It's like, hey, go do something like this. And before we even get into, obviously we're not getting into classified stuff, but even at the open source level, you start to learn about the Iranian security infrastructure, and they have this domestic militia called the Basij, and they have all these secret police organizations, and you have all these Islamic extremist organizations, the Shia types in Iran, and you start to read through that. This is not just a case where, you can go in and you can kill an Ayatollah, and then you can enable the good people of Iran to rise up. This is going to be a civil war scenario. It looks like to me. There's nothing. I'm not seeing anything that says to me that the Basij and these Iranian extremist groups, the domestic security groups, are just going to say, well, the Ayatollah's dead. I guess we're just going to let democracy take over. It's just a pipe dream. And so I really hope the Trump administration is seriously taking into consideration the second and third order effects. Which would you rather have? An Iran that is trying to get a nuclear weapon but can't, or a new Iranian government, or maybe even just a civil war where you have radiological material floating around? I think that's a pretty easy answer. All right. With that, Robert, let's go ahead and move on and talk about China's response. Just looking at China and Russia, they obviously do not want regime change in Iran. They want to keep their pet country. They want to keep it on the leash here. So what's the latest from China?
So China's foreign minister Wang Yi said that China is concerned that this conflict between Israel and Iran could get out of control. And in a diplomatic call with Omani officials yesterday, said that China and Oman cannot sit idly by and let the region slide into a quote, quote, unknown abyss. And so far, this has been the extent of China's support for Iran, has been pushing for a diplomatic solution to the conflict. And as far as I could find, has not sent military support to Iran yet, specifically for this conflict with Israel. I think China likely does not want to get pulled into a Middle East conflict, especially with the United States on the other side. And China, I think, as we've previously reported, views the South China Sea as the decisive theater against the U.S. However, China purchases 90% of Iran's oil exports, which accounts for 60, as far as I could find, 16% of China's crude oil imports. So they do have a major interest in a stable Iran.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I have seen people float this concept of one reason why the Trump administration might want regime change in Iran is to put another check on Chinese oil, which is going to make long-term operations on Taiwan maybe we'll say much more difficult. But all right, listen, we could war game this to death. We'll just have to wait and see what comes out. But Robert, just in terms of the possible strike, have you seen any timeline on when we could expect this to happen?
Speaking on background, apparently people that are involved with the White House discussions on this are saying as possibly as soon as this weekend. And they did say, if there are some federal agencies, they didn't name the agencies that are preparing for a strike by the weekend. So I'm keeping an eye out to see if that does happen. Like I said before, though, unfortunately, I don't, because of how Trump interacts with the media, and they're, like you said, they're constantly asking him this question, and he's just basically saying, yeah, I will or I won't. We might not know until it happens.
Mm-hmm. All right. And just on this topic, last thing, we'll move on. I've also I read in the news of the past 24 hours or so that the Israelis are maybe entertaining a special forces, like boots on the ground strike, like similar to what they did in Syria, a year, however long ago that was. We'll see. So I guess the Israelis probably have some contingency plans in the event that Trump says we're not going to strike this. But I mean, I think everything from what I'm seeing, I mean, I think it's fairly obvious this is going to happen. All right. So with that, let's go ahead and Robert, if you can, give us an update on this screwworm that's coming up from Mexico.
The USDA announced plans yesterday for an $8.5 million facility in South Texas. And they said this is to fight the spread of the New World screwworm. And it's expected to be completed by the end of this year. And it's going to release sterile screwworms into northern Mexico. Because as you can see on this map, starting last year, it started moving north. Normally, it's contained in the Darien Gap on the southern Mexico border. But it's apparently been moving northward over the last year. And the Trump administration has already banned the import of live cattle due to the threat of Mexican cattle moving northward, bringing that New World screwworm to the United States. And what I could find as far as potential damages, before it was eradicated in the United States in the 50s and 60s, the USDA estimated it did cost the cattle industry $50 to $100 million annually. So there's a potential here for an even greater disruption of the cattle industry, and especially as I still see, or last I've looked, agricultural economists are still saying that the U.S. ag industry is on the brink of a recession, if not in a recession. And two, anytime now the cattle industry is going to start rebuilding herds. So if that does hit, that's going to be, I think, a major blow to the cattle industry, and we're going to see increased meat prices inside the United States.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. All right. And Robert, I know you've been following this for a while, so thanks for the update. All right. With that, we will get to some questions here. And let's see here. Sorry, guys. Jared's out, so we will muddle through without him. All right. Are you guys still doing courses like tactical intelligence course? Well, no, not currently. I do have some courses planned. I'll be teaching some tech intel courses. It's a 3-day intelligence course on how to set up a local intelligence effort to track protests, riots, earthquakes, hurricanes, wildfires, natural or man-made disasters, whatever you have. You can use this training to support search and rescue operations, support your county sheriff finding lost children in the national forest, just all sorts of applications here. So yes, as soon as we get done with this new website shift and migrating everyone over, I'll be publishing my training schedule for the rest of the year. As a reminder, if you want to drop a question into the chat, please start it with a capital Q. That way we can find it more easily. All right, with estimates that, about 16% of China's oil imports are from Iran. That means about 10% of their oil is from Iran. How much would China suffer from that loss? Well, 10% is not catastrophic. I think they would feel 10%. That's not to say that maybe they couldn't just buy more oil from some other country. China's oil imports are still a problem because 80% still are trafficked through through Malacca Strait. So I think that's part of the big problem here. All right, with the current mood of U.S. citizens toward the Middle East conflict and knowledge of false flag operations, could this backfire domestically for Israel by drawing the U.S. into another war? Well, Robert, we have seen there's competing narratives here because all these pollsters, they have these latest surveys of which Republicans support and how many Americans don't support, et cetera, et cetera. What's the latest, just kind of broad brushstroke, what's the latest you've seen from the polling data, or have you, about whether Americans support a strike on Iran?
So I've seen a couple polls put out. I don't recall what polling houses did that showed it was basically an 80-20 in supporter strikes, but I think YouGov's latest poll that was published yesterday showed the opposite. It's 80-20 against the U.S. joining the conflict. And as far as, the current mood, I think that after 20 plus years of the GWOT, most people are at the very least tired of it dominating the news cycle, dominating the country. And so I don't think I think the YouGov poll is probably more accurate. I think most people are not interested in having the U.S. drawn into another Middle East conflict.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially considering what we've covered with Elbridge Colby joining the DoD. Colby says the Middle East and Europe are not the decisive theaters. The decisive theater for the next century for the United States is going to be the South China Sea and Taiwan. And it just seems like this is a large distraction from the strategic level fight that the United States has been anticipating. I saw a video of the Crown Prince of Iran. If the Ayatollah does get whacked, what is the chance of the monarchy being restored in Iran? I don't know. I'm sure quite high he'll be allowed to come back. It kind of depends on, frankly, it should just depend on what the Iranian people want. If the Iranian people say they want a democracy or monarchy, they should just be allowed to figure it out for themselves. Unfortunately, historically, that's not what happens. Trump has heretofore been against involvement in wars. What are the odds that all of Trump's bluster and positioning of military assets is a bluff, is in order to bluff Iran into a more conciliatory mood? Robert, that's something that we have discussed. Is this the art of the deal, where Trump is trying to pressure Iran into negotiations? I just saw this morning, I think Trump said it's not too late, but he's been saying in recent days his patience is wearing thin. He may not be interested in talking very much longer. It sure seems art of the dealy to me. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I agree. I think this is Trump's attempt to get Iran back to the negotiating table on Trump's terms. However, I think Iran's latest statement has been they will not negotiate under duress. So negotiations are still ongoing, and we could see potentially a deal before the weekend, and before Trump decides whether or not to conduct a strike.
Mm-hmm. All right, can China project power in the Middle East militarily, or are they only able to handle their own backyard? Well, this is definitely a Jared question. We know that China has, I believe, conducted carrier operations along with Oman in that part of the world. I'm not sure this is an area where China is able to project a lot of power into, though. I don't think their Navy's built for this for power projection into the Middle East. I frankly think they have their hands full by trying to project power into their neighbors. Robert, do you have any other thoughts?
No, as far as I know, they're the PLA and all the branches of the PLA are like many states other than the United States designed for regime security and regional security. And as far as I have read and heard, China is more, at least publicly, interested most in power projection within the South China Sea and within their own region and area of influence or sphere of influence.
Certainly. All right, Trump's strategy has shifted from Europe to China. Does Trump see Iran as a detour to avoid so he can stay focused on his strategic objective? Listen, I don't know what Trump's thinking here. I think Trump really likes having the whole world breathlessly cover his every latest comment on whether he will or he won't strike Iran. I think that makes Trump get very giddy. But in terms of if Trump sees Iran as a detour, I guess that's probably a big debate they're having at the Pentagon and White House right now. As you said, Elbridge Colby says the South China Sea is the decisive theater. The Middle East is not the decisive theater. So I don't know. Question from last week. What are the odds that Israel's strike on Iran paves the way for a popular revolution in Iran? Any stats on internal support for the current regime? Well, listen, we know there is a revolutionary movement within Iran. And I mean, I think that's kind of the $1 million question here, Ben, is I think this is probably a question that the Trump administration is considering, obviously. Is this going to be a one and done? We're going to strike the Fordow nuclear facility and make sure that Iran can't get a nuclear weapon for another 3, 5, 10 years, however long it takes them, 20 years. Or, as the Israelis probably want, are we going to make sure that Iran is not going to get a nuclear weapon by taking out the regime that's pursuing a nuclear weapon? And I think this may be the hinge where the Trump administration is trying to navigate the matter they're trying to navigate. Robert, any other thoughts?
I haven't seen specific polling on support, but I think you'd have to take any kind of polling with a grain of salt because, one, there probably is significant support for the current government. Most people just want stability, even if it is under a government that we might see as oppressive. And then the other problem with the polling is preference falsification. That was a big. So basically, people will answer how they believe that the pollsters want them to answer, or even in the case of Iran, like we saw, like in Syria ahead of the Arab Spring, Assad had widespread support according to polling, and a lot of it was preference falsification. People were afraid to speak out politically against the Assad regime, and I'm sure there is a section of the Iranian population that is afraid to do the same.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, I don't think we could trust any polling data coming out of there. All right, last question for you, Robert. Regarding this screwworm issue, do we have data on the South American and Caribbean losses, numbers on what to expect if it does get into the U.S.?
I haven't seen any specific numbers. The USDA, they're basically, this is a preemptive move. I didn't see any specifics on in Mexico any cattle that have been infected for sure. But I think they're basically doing this as a preemptive measure in case it is spreading northward, because I think there was a handful of reports in the southern part of Mexico, but it is moving north of the Darien Gap. And the USDA is also expanding their anti-screwworm operations. Basically, disperse these sterile screwworms around to prevent reproduction, and they are expanding that near the Darien Gap as well. So they're basically doing an all above approach, just because I think they expect it could be very devastating if it does get past the southern border.
All right. Thanks for that, Robert. And that's going to do it for today's show. Everyone, thanks so much for your support. Thanks for watching. And we will be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on this show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.